Hello and welcome to this lecture video on finding and reading sources. After today, students should be able to analyze and skim potential sources for relevant information and identify and describe the different parts of a peer-reviewed article. There are three main types of sources we're going to look at here. There are primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources. Primary sources are the raw data that we use to test hypotheses. This can include first-hand accounts, objects, data, etc. that come directly from our unit of interest or unit of analysis. Secondary sources are research reports or second-hand accounts of primary sources. They use the raw data of this primary source to provide a write-up and analysis of that data. A research article, what we're going to be looking at primarily today, is a secondary source. Tertiary sources, on the other hand, are typically books or articles that summarize secondary sources. This can include things like textbooks, encyclopedias, review articles, summaries, etc. This video is going to primarily focus on those secondary sources that are research articles. Research articles are peer-reviewed, which means they've gone through a process of having their articles sent out to other people, those other scholars reviewing those articles, providing feedback and analysis, and giving that feedback and analysis back to the original author. Typically, these research articles use primary data to test some sort of hypothesis or use primary data to develop theories. They're typically published in what we call journals, and the library has access to a lot of these journals and can request articles that they do not have immediate access to. A research article has a number of different parts. They're not always labeled like I have them labeled here, but generally each research article is going to have a section that covers each of these parts. Research articles have an abstract, introduction, literature review, description of data and methods, some sort of data analysis or findings or results, a discussion of said results, conclusion, and a bibliography. The abstract is a short summary of the research topic, questions, methods, and findings. It's usually around 200 words, and it's usually found at the very start of an article so that you, the reader, can decide if that article is going to be useful to you or not. The introduction typically sets up the rest of the paper. It should include an introduction to the topic, providing some background and relevant information about the topic in general. It should also answer, why is this topic important? Why should I, the reader, care about this topic? And why is it interesting? It will typically, but not always, introduce the research questions and sometimes the hypothesis and etc. It'll also typically outline the rest of the paper with the main points that are going to be argued in each section. The literature review is the next section in a research article. The literature review typically makes clear the theoretical context of the question and topic, explores what other scholars have done around that topic, focuses on the key details, and avoids lengthy summaries of individual sources. Instead, it tends to be organized around a theme, using those articles and other secondary sources as evidence to support those themes. It typically starts broad and gets more specific as you go along, concluding with how the authors will contribute to the literature, the hypotheses for that article, and a brief description of how the authors are going to test those hypotheses. Next, research articles typically have a data and methods section where they outline the ways that they're going to collect and analyze the data. This should include information about the unit of analysis, independent variables, dependent variables, sampling frames, and any other methods that are used to collect and analyze the data. It discusses how the data is collected, manipulated, and analyzed, and includes how participants or data were found and any issues that came up with that process. This can vary widely based on the methods being used. The analysis and findings section, also sometimes called the results section, has a number of different names. This is typically where the authors will display the results of their research. In quantitative research, this will usually include tables that highlight the results and discuss how they are related to their hypotheses. Qualitative research usually includes summaries of major findings and how it relates to current and new theories. Again, this is typically organized around major hypotheses or major ideas and may vary depending on the type of research. Next, we have a discussion. This is where we talk about how the results relate to everything else that's been talked about in the paper. So what do the results mean for the hypotheses and the overall topic? What do the results mean theoretically? How do they tie back into the literature review that was done? What do the results mean for policy? What are some empirical applications or implications of this research and these findings? And what do the results mean for future research? The conclusion of a research article typically is very short. It provides a brief summary of the paper, why it's important, what you found, the implications, and avenues for future research. It's frequently included with a discussion, sometimes not even separated out into another section. Lastly, we have the bibliography or works cited or references cited, where they list all the different articles and sources that they used in their research. Once we've found an article, we need to talk about how we can evaluate those research articles. The first thing to check when we find an article is it peer-reviewed? One way of doing this is to check the box in the search function on the library website to say you want only peer-reviewed articles. This will eliminate all the non-peer-reviewed articles. If you find an article that you're not sure about, you can always Google the journal title. Typically, if it says Journal of American Sociology or Journal of Immigration or something like that, it's going to be usually, not always, usually peer-reviewed. And you can go to that website, Google that journal, and check to see if it's peer-reviewed. The next step is to skim the abstract for keywords. Is it going to be relevant to your research? If you read the abstract and you don't think it's going to be relevant, you don't need to read anymore. So basically what I recommend is read the abstract. If you think it's relevant, keep going. If you read the abstract and think, this doesn't make sense to me, I don't know what it's talking about, I don't think it's relevant, move on, pick another article. Next, you can start to read the introduction, get an idea of what the topic is going to be, a little more details about the research question and where that article is going. And then if you still think it's relevant, you still think it's interesting, you can go and look at the conclusion. The questions to ask yourself when reading the introduction and conclusion is this relevant to my research? What are the major findings? And how might I use this article in my own literature review? If you still think this article is interesting and worth reading, you can skim the rest of the article and make a note of the main highlights and methods used in that article. Alright, that's all for this lecture.